Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Once again this morning, we find ourselves in the thick of Mark's Gospel, that fast-paced, action-packed, streamlined account of Jesus' ministry. Mark's Gospel is the earliest one, written around 65 BCE when the Roman Empire had laid siege to Jerusalem. Mark's community was in deep distress. Their world was falling apart. Finding and holding on to the hope that God was still with them was essential to them. The memories and stories of Jesus were a powerful vehicle of that hope. And our passage this morning is something that highfalutin Bible scholars call a Markan sandwich. A catchy little term that describes one of Mark's favorite literary patterns, putting one story right smack in the middle of another one. So we start with the story of Jairus' daughter, and then we detail into the story of the bleeding woman. And while on the surface they may appear to have a great number of differences, at their core and at their most profound level, they are the very same story. They are about two people who, when touched by Jesus, were transformed from death into life. Now I have to confess, I approach this passage this morning with a lot of uncertainty. For as inspirational as they are, miracle stories can be rather difficult. I desperately want to believe them, but I'm haunted by the doubts and pain of real-life experiences. How do you preach miraculous healings to people who live every day with real physical suffering? On the surface of this passage, it would appear to be a sermon already prepackaged. Jesus wrote it for me. Do not fear, only believe. Amen. Yet how many of you feel okay with leaving it there? I don't. In my role as pastor, I've been privileged to sit with people at their hospital bedsides, or accompany them as they get test results from doctors, or talk with them in the midst of their chemotherapy. I know that many of you have been through these experiences, either yourself personally or with someone you love. There are a lot of emotions swirling around at these times. There's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of praying for a miracle. And there's a lot of awkward silence. When someone is facing a life-threatening illness, the words, do not fear, only believe, seem a little underwhelming. For we know that for every person who makes it through their health crisis, there are many, many more who do not. It would be simple to say that the ones who got cured had faith, and the others did not. Simple, but dead wrong. The implication being that the one who wasn't cured just didn't love God enough for God to love her back. And that's some pretty frightening theology. So how do we approach these stories of faith healing? How do we account for the role of miracles in our gospel stories? Do we take them at face value as supernatural events? Or do they tell us something more? For those of us who are participating in our Wednesday evening Bible experience, we've learned to look at our scriptures through new lenses, putting aside the old literal ones that insist that these stories are factual and that all their meaning is right there in the words on the surface. Which is really a good thing. We're setting that aside, for that reading can often lead us to the scary theology I just mentioned. Instead, we've been given a new prescription, one that invites us to see these stories more deeply as metaphors. Not fiction, mind you, but metaphors. Stories that have a more than literal meaning. Stories that have multiple layers of meaning. Stories that can transform us rather than just inform us. In this way, a metaphor is very much like a parable, which was Jesus' favorite way of teaching. It's not about a superficial reading of the plot or the characters, but about the deeper meaning they point to. Yet a metaphor doesn't tell us what it means. It invites us to ask that question of ourselves, from our own location, from our own yearnings and our own experiences. And like a parable, the gospel metaphors are always telling us something about who God is. So the two stories we encountered this morning focus apparently on two women. The first woman is really just a girl, 12 years old, the daughter of a wealthy and important leader of the synagogue, Jairus. She has suddenly taken ill, and her father is out of his mind with worry, so much so that he lets go of all the concerns of his position, about status and protocol, and he simply throws himself at the feet of this traveling faith healer. For the second woman, her desire to get close to Jesus is also an act of desperation, as well as a sign of her marginalization. For her illness, what is essentially a 12-year menstrual period, has rendered her completely untouchable in the community. Unlike the highly respected Jairus' daughter, this woman is an outsider in every way. Jewish purity laws forbid the touching of any woman during her cycle. So imagine what kind of isolation and loneliness she has suffered over these many years. No family, no friends, no synagogue, no human contact at all. One wonders how she survived. In fact, she has so internalized her untouchable status that she didn't even dare let Jesus know she was there. No dramatic gestures for her. She just got close enough to anonymously touch the edge of his robe. But he knew she was there. He could feel his healing energy go from his body. And Jesus knew that she needed to be touched back. The presence of touch in this story is important. For whether he is laying hands on folks, or wiping their eyes, or gathering children to his lap, or washing the feet of his disciples, Jesus was a touchy guy. Bodies mattered to him. He couldn't walk by someone who was hurt or ill without reaching out to help. Tending to the sick and vulnerable is a priority of Jesus. And therefore, we can dare to say it is a priority of God. As I was preparing my sermon this week, the Supreme Court handed down its decision on the health care law. And it seemed a most fitting interruption to my reflections on the importance of physical healing in the gospel story. But the mandate to care for these, the least of these, those sick and needing brothers and sisters of ours, goes back further than our Gospels, further than our New Testament. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible tell us that God will judge our nations not by our wealth and our power, but by how we treat the least of these, the weakest members of our society. So while I don't want to get political here, and I'm aware that this particular bill that just passed is fraught with social and legal and economic implications that will be argued for years. Although as a parent of 2 young adult children under the age of 26, I'm sleeping a little easier these days. But if we strip away all of the posturing and the talking points from both sides, the bottom line is this. Caring for the health of all people, especially the most marginalized, is something Jesus did a lot. I'm just saying. But I digress. Most all of us know what it's like to physically suffer in some way. It is at the core of our human experience. And so we know the fear and the helplessness that accompanies it. So on a purely superficial level, we can relate to the desperation of these folks in the story, and we can rejoice at the miraculous cure that they have received. But we can also experience a rather painful discomfort when we think about the times in our own lives when a miraculous cure wasn't found. Why wasn't my cancer cured? Why did my child die? These questions can begin that downward spiral of anger and doubt and hopelessness that often leads to despair, which is the problem with miracle stories. More often than not, they highlight the absence of miracles in our own lives rather than increase our faith. So how can we hear these stories as good news for all? How can we approach them in a way that deepens our faith and brings us closer to God? Perhaps we need to see miracles in a different light and with new lenses too. For what is a miracle really? Is it changing God's mind so that she gives us what we want? Is it God stepping in to rearrange the world to serve our agenda? Or is it changing ourselves so that we recognize and accept what God already knows we need? One theologian remarked that a miracle is not when God does the will of humanity, but when humanity does the will of God. That is a miracle. A miracle happens when we ourselves are transformed. Miracles are not always what we imagine them to be, and neither, I would argue, is healing. Notice that Jesus does not say he will cure these people, but he will heal them. A cure deals with a specific physical situation. Healing addresses the whole person. Everyone who is cured, Jairus' daughter and the bleeding woman, will someday die. Physical cure is a temporary thing for all of us. But true healing means more than just health. If we look at the healing metaphorically through those lenses, we can see that it is pointing beyond itself to a deeper and more powerful reality. Reading the story that way, we might see a child who is dying before her time as a person who has not yet learned to live. We might see a woman who is bleeding for 12 years as a person whose life has been slowly and steadily draining out of her. And we can ask ourselves then, what does it mean for us to live more fully? To embrace life more abundantly? And what does it mean for us to lose it? In both of these stories, we are called beyond the surface to find the healing between the lines. True healing, the kind that Jesus gives, is ultimately about restoring meaning to people's lives, no matter what their physical situation may be. To touch Jesus, to be in relationship with him, is to find a source of ultimate meaning, a wellspring of life that heals our brokenness and revives our souls. While the stories seem to be about two ill and unnamed women, they are really about each of us who feels the life draining out of us and who desire desperately to be called back to life. And real life is ours to have, even when we are suffering. For real life comes from a deeper awareness of the God who loves us. For those of us who call ourselves Christians, Jesus is that connection to real life. For it is through him that we see and are seen by the face of God. Fear, which Jesus speaks about so often, is the barrier to that real life. Fear cuts God out of the equation. When Jairus threw himself at Jesus' feet and the bleeding woman broke all the rules to touch Jesus, they had let go of their fear. Nothing was going to get in the way of their trusting Jesus, who in turn ultimately trusts God. The gospel stories, like the parables that Jesus himself told within them, are ultimately about who God is and what God does. This is not a story about happy endings or easy answers. It is not a tidy response to the challenging and eternal question of why human beings suffer. But it does tell us about what God does in the face of our suffering, which is to reach out and to touch us and to draw us into deeper relationship, not that we might be merely cured, but that we might be truly healed. And that is good news to share, no matter how we name our pain, no matter who we are.